Yorkshire, 1849. A place where silence clings to the moors, and even memory gets swallowed by the mist. Before we begin, take a breath. What you're about to hear isn't a ghost story. There are no demons here, no curses, no wailing spirits in the attic. Just names that were erased. Children who were told to forget them, and a building that stood for over 40 years, without ever being officially recognized. If this kind of hidden history unsettles you, the kind that lives in records redacted and walls sealed shut, then subscribe and tell us in the comments, do you believe silence protects the guilty, or buries the truth? Granhurst Orphanage was never meant to be famous. No architectural blueprints survive. No royal funding, no plaques. Yet, from 1824 to 1863, over 247 children were processed behind its gates. The word they used was processed, not raised, not educated. Processed. It sat on the eastern edge of Yorkshire, not far from the coast where sea winds make even summer feel like morning. Locals called it the White House, not for its color, but because the windows had no curtains. Just stark panes, all identical, all watching. It was operated under the title, the Granhurst Home for Orphaned and Wayward Girls, though both those words orphaned and wayward were often loosely interpreted. A girl with no father but a living mother taken in. A girl who spoke too much in church taken in. But Granhurst didn't function like other institutions. There were no hymns sung before bed, no birthday celebrations, no surnames. Instead, children were given letters, not names. A was quiet. B was compliant. C was prone to outbursts. The files that remain, and there are only a few, were found in the private attic of a retired physician who died in 1903. They were handwritten, bound in leather, and labeled simply, Cognitive Rebuilding, Early Successes and Failures. At first glance, one might assume it was research into trauma recovery, but look closer and you'll find phrases like, subject ceased referring to self in the first person. Marked erasure of early memory chains achieved via Schedule 4 isolation. Second attempt at emotion suppression via praise deprivation protocol shows stronger compliance. Who funded this? How was it legal? Why were no charges ever filed? The trail leads us deeper not into myths or monsters but into methodologies reports and the quiet smile of a woman named Lady Isolde Farrow, the woman who founded Granhurst and never once referred to it as an orphanage. She called it the place where unwritten souls are given form. Her portrait still hangs in a private collection in Sussex. A woman in her late 30s, pale dressed in dove-gray silk with gloved hands folded at her waist and a faint smile that seems to withhold something. The artist never signed it, but on the back of the canvas, in faint pencil, someone wrote, "Grace is not inherited. It is constructed." That line, "Grace is constructed," appears dozens of times in the Granhurst field notes, and it offers the clearest window we have into Lady Isolde Farrow, the patron saint of obedience. Born 1804 into a minor noble family with deep ties to the Anglican Church, Lady Farrow was orphaned young. She was raised not by relatives, but by the Daughters of Temperance, a private religious order known for its harsh, silent discipline. Those formative years left a mark. By age 26, she had already published 2 tracts on the dangers of indulgent affection in child-rearing, and by 30 had founded Granhurst Hall on a quiet, wind-beaten rise in Yorkshire. She claimed it would serve those whom society has discarded before they had a chance to become righteous. But Granhurst was no mission. There were no sermons, no weekly services. Children were not baptized, confirmed, or taught scripture in any traditional sense. Instead, Lady Farrow introduced what she called the doctrine of grace construction, a rigid, 5-phase system intended to strip away inherited wickedness and replace it with absolute neutrality. Neutrality, she believed, was the cleanest foundation from which one could build virtue. The 5 phases were documented in full isolation of origin. Children were never told their surnames. Any previous memories were dismissed as false attachments. Personal items were burned upon entry. Erasure of reflexive identity. Use of I and me was forbidden. Children were referred to by letters or numbers. Mirrors were removed. Cognitive reordering through repetition. Mantras, like "nothing is mine, all is granted," were recited daily. Any deviation resulted in silence penalties, emotional withholding, and substitution. Displays of affection were punished, praise was removed entirely. In its place, success was rewarded with absence of punishment. Final integration, grace reborn. Children who passed the 4 prior phases were cleared to receive a new name. These names were often short, elegant, and entirely devoid of familial meaning. Lace, elm, rue, bray. Lady Farrow referred to these children as the Graceborn. Visitors, few and carefully selected, would often report how peaceful the halls seemed, how quiet the children were, how polite and well-groomed and obedient. But no one stayed overnight, and none of the Graceborn ever wrote letters home. Records indicate that between 1826 and 1852 over 100 children were processed at Granhurst. Of those, less than a dozen were ever documented as adopted. Most disappeared into institutions, private households, or simply stopped appearing in the ledgers altogether. In one report buried beneath medical notes from 1837, a scribbled margin reads, "Rue did not respond well to the absence protocol." Screaming resumed. Escalated to Phase 3, C Phase 3C. There is no formal definition of Phase 3C in any official Granhurst documents, but in Eleanor Wade's later testimony she described it as the room where the lights never changed. There was no paint on the walls, no art, no alphabet blocks, no chalk drawings, just rows of iron-framed cots, each evenly spaced, each with the same gray sheet. This was not a nursery. This was the entry chamber, where children were scrubbed, shorn, and unpersoned. They called it the Black Lace Room, not because it held anything delicate, but because of the curtains. Black, sheer, stitched with thick embroidered lace. It filtered the outside light into long, soft shadows that never changed. Even at noon, it felt like dusk. Every child admitted to Granhurst spent their first 40 days in this room. No schoolwork, no play, just silence, routine, and the slow unraveling of whatever they remembered. The day began at 6 a.m. sharp, marked by a bell, not rung by hand but triggered by a hidden lever in Lady Farrow's study. The bell meant rise-fold bedding stand by the cot eyes forward. Children were not allowed to speak until spoken to. Even then, the only accepted responses were, "Yes, sister," "I receive," "Grace is quiet." Every 4 children shared one caretaker, a woman dressed not in nun's robes but in gray linen with white gloves. They were never introduced. Their names were not given. They were simply called Sister, followed by a number. Eleanor remembered hers Sister 9. Each meal was identical thin porridge with no salt. Each day the same memorization drills, eye contact training, and the mirror stillness exercise where children were made to sit opposite each other and match expressions, or the lack thereof, for up to an hour. One of the most disturbing elements of the nursery system was the naming clock. A large wooden wheel mounted above the entrance with letters A through Z and digits 0 through 9. Each morning, the wheel was spun. Where it landed, that was your designation for the day. One morning, you might be B7, the next Q3. By the time the 40 days ended, few children remembered what they'd once been called. From a psychological perspective, the strategy was brutally effective. Strip away constancy, disrupt associations, replace identity with procedural correctness. There was one corner of the nursery, however, that drew quiet terror, a small alcove behind a privacy screen where disobedient children were taken. The others called it the grayskin corner, not because of what happened there, but because of how the children returned. Quieter, palest, and in many cases unable to speak for several days. Eleanor recounted her first time in that room. She was 5. She tried to whisper the name of her sister to another girl just once. She was grabbed by the wrist, walked calmly behind the screen, and made to sit in a chair under a dripping tap. The chair was metal. The tap never stopped. A basin filled slowly beneath her feet, ice cold. No one spoke. No one struck her. But she sat there for hours, cold water soaking her ankles as a metronome ticked beside her left ear. Nothing more, just tick, 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 until even the name she'd whispered began to feel like someone else's. By the time the 40 days were over, Eleanor had stopped resisting the naming clock. She took her number. She made her bed. She didn't cry. Children who adjusted were said to be laced, not in reference to clothing but to obedience, woven tight, bound inward, no loose threads, and those who didn't, they didn't stay in the nursery, they went elsewhere. Lady Isolde Farrow did not consider herself cruel. In her journals, what little survives, she speaks not of punishment, but of alignment. "We are not extinguishing the self," she wrote. "We are correcting its direction." It was a doctrine of removal, not of violence, but of vacancy. She believed that evil was not taught, but inherent, that even infants bore selfishness like a shadow clinging to the soul, and thus the only path to virtue was subtraction. The doctrine of reshaping was designed as a 5-phase process. Each phase had a name. Each name implied gentleness. None lived up to it. Phase 1, stillness. Training children were required to sit in complete silence for increasing intervals, beginning with 10 minutes later extended to 4 hours. Any twitch blink or eye movement was met with resetting the clock. They were told grace sits longer than temptation. Sister tutors observed with slates in hand, logging every movement, noting the children most prone to internal interference. Phase 2, sensory refinement. Bright light was removed. Sound was dulled. Children wore linen gloves and soft-soled shoes. They were assigned daily object exercises, sorting pebbles by warmth, identifying feathers by weight, but never told whether they were correct. The goal was not education, it was detachment, to dull their need for reward, to make obedience an instinct, not a transaction. Phase 3, language withdrawal. At the start of this phase, children were told to surrender all language for 7 days. No reading, no writing, no speaking. Those who attempted to communicate were placed in the ash room, a chamber with black walls and white floors, where they were isolated with only a Bible in Latin mounted too high to reach. Many children broke. Some whispered to themselves just to hear a voice. Eleanor Wade lasted 6 days. On the 7th, she began to hum. Softly, a nursery melody she couldn't quite name. She was removed and placed under what they called corrective sleep. The details of this procedure are unclear, but Eleanor described it later as a bed with buckles and a mask with steam that made me dream of forgetting. Phase 4, identity displacement. After sufficient silence and sensory detachment, children were told to choose a new name, not from their past, but from a fixed list of nouns, stone ash cloud thread bone. They were told this was their final name. If they hesitated or declined, a name was assigned. These names were then stitched into gray uniforms worn every day until departure if there ever was one. No surnames, no origins, just objects. "You are no longer becoming Lady Farrow," once wrote. "You are now a part of the order." Phase 5, submission through absence. This final phase was not always reached. Some children never made it past 3. Others remained in Phase 4 for years. But for those selected the most silent, the most still. Phase 5 was initiated through what the files call the grace ceremony. It was performed in a room with no lights, no staff, just a chair and a box. Children were instructed to sit open the box and follow the instructions inside alone. What those instructions were is unknown. But after the ceremony, those children no longer answered to their names. They ceased initiating contact. They no longer cried even when injured. They were called the reclaimed. Outsiders praised their calmness, their obedience, their lack of fuss. What they didn't see were the nights when a dozen children sat awake in their beds, eyes open, unmoving, staring at nothing. Granhurst was not shaping children. It was hollowing them. And yet it was admired. Lady Farrow received letters from judges, deans, bishops, all praising her methodical restoration of moral girls. No one asked what was lost, only what was gained. There was no lock on the door. It didn't need one. The ash room at Granhurst was not about containment. It was about erosion. A child could leave at any time in theory, but they never did, because to leave was to be noticed, and to be noticed meant you weren't ready. The room itself measured just 10 feet by 10, black plaster walls, a single high window sealed in iron lattice. The floor was white, not painted, but tiled in pale marble streaked with faint natural gray veins. Hence the name. No furniture, no blankets, no clock. Only two things broke the uniformity: a chair in the corner made of painted wood, and a Bible affixed high on the far wall, written in Latin, unreachable by height and unreadable by age. The purpose of the Bible was never theological. It was there to remind the child of a language they could not access, a knowledge just out of reach. Children were placed in the ash room for one of three reasons they spoke during the language withdrawal phase. They cried or requested personal items. They asked about their families. Each violation, they were told, revealed residual identity clinging to the soul. In her testimony, Eleanor Wade described her first placement. "They didn't drag me. They walked beside me. Sister 9 told me don't touch the walls. They absorb." I thought she meant the dirt, but she meant something else. Time inside was not measured. There were no hourglasses. No meals were brought unless you were ready. You knocked once when you believed you were empty. They rarely opened the door the first time. Children learned quickly hunger is not punishment, it is training. Some sang to themselves in the early days. Others recited numbers backward and forward. One girl, noted only as W3, carved tally marks into her palms with her nails. They faded eventually. The staff didn't respond to these behaviors. They watched, they recorded, and when the child stopped resisting when they sat for hours, unmoving, unspeaking, then the door opened. Sister 9 had a phrase for it. Ash stays quiet. Fire complains. Eleanor stayed there 3 times. The longest stretch lasted 9 days. She survived on cold broth and a cup of water slid across the floor. No contact, no words. She forgot her sister's voice during those days. And when she left the room, she did not speak again for a month. This was seen as progress. There were rumors, never confirmed, that some children were left longer. That a boy from the earlier years called D6 spent 17 days inside and emerged blind in one eye. But no medical records remain, only a ledger note D6 reassigned. Laced. To Granhurst, silence was not absence, it was achievement. A silent child was a controlled child. A child detached from history, from memory, from origin. A child who could be written over. And once they had passed the ash room, they rarely resisted again. It was not on the original grounds. The garden house stood apart from Granhurst's main building at the edge of a wind-worn field, surrounded by stone walls choked with ivy. From a distance, it appeared almost pastoral. 2 stories, whitewashed, a little chimney that never smoked, an iron gate with floral motifs. Visitors were told it was the convalescent wing, a place for children needing quiet recuperation. But no child ever returned from it with color in their cheeks. No child ever returned the same. The entrance was peculiar. You didn't knock, you were brought. And when the door closed, it locked from the outside with a bolt as long as a forearm. Inside silence, but not the soft spiritual kind. The kind that hums with surveillance. Eleanor only glimpsed its interior once at age 11 when she was chosen to deliver folded linen. She remembers the smell, first vinegar paper and burnt starch. There were no windows that opened, no sound of birds, though it sat beside a thicket. Instead, along the walls hung framed drawings supposedly made by the children who lived there. Except they all depicted the same scene: a table, a chair, a mirror, and a door, never open. Each drawing was signed by a different hand, but the strokes were identical, mechanical, as if rehearsed. The staff inside the garden house were not called sisters. They were called guides. They dressed in brown coats. Their shoes made no sound. And unlike the other staff, they never made eye contact with the children. Guides didn't speak aloud unless to give instructions, and those instructions were always phrased the same way the guide sees you. The guide requests silence. The guide records this. The children inside wore white smocks with nothing else. Their heads were shaved monthly. Each was assigned a companion number, not for communication, but for documentation. No one had an actual name here. What happened inside the garden house was called finalization, a term that doesn't appear in any official education manual, only in the margin notes of one ledger signed in the initials IF. It appears the purpose was threefold: isolate those who resisted reshaping. break those who retained memory, repurpose those who survived the break. Eleanor once saw a girl from the garden house walking the perimeter of the main orphanage 2 weeks later. She was sweeping ash with her bare hands. There was a small bell stitched into the collar of her smock, one that chimed every time she bent forward. She didn't speak. She didn't blink much. When Eleanor whispered the girl's real name, Beatrice, the girl, didn't react. But that night, Eleanor was woken up and moved to another dormitory without explanation. She never saw Beatrice again. The garden house became the destination for the unruly, the unshapeable, the rememberers. And once sent there, a child's presence was reduced to a single entry in the ledger transferred for guidance. No date of return, no further notes, just a drawn line across the page like a rope pulled taut. They arrived with pocket watches and polished boots, always in pairs, always with a letter from someone important. The visitors were not clergy. They were not nobility. They were something far more elusive men of science. Their names rarely appear in full. Initials mostly, sometimes a surname and title: Dr. A. Pendrick Society for Mental Refinement, Reverend Leading Scholar H. Bluer, Oxford Observational College Lieutenant CMDR W. Howell, Naval Health Initiative Civilian Study Arm. Each left behind pages of clinical observation annotated in restrained academic prose. Subject shows remarkable detachment from prior identifiers. Promising candidate for responsive testing. Latency in moral recall is now measurable. Early conditioning appears effective. They didn't ask why Granhurst existed. They studied how well it performed. Their visits followed a pattern: arrival unannounced, brief exchange with Lady Farrow or her deputy sister Lydia, quiet inspection of records, direct sessions with selected children. One former assistant, known only by the pseudonym NM, later testified anonymously in 1891. They brought metal cases, cloth hoods, and something they called the hollow mirror. I was told not to look during the tests, just hold the child afterward. What those tests involved remains unclear. But several documents mention a technique called memory windowing, an attempt to trigger and erase specific memories through sensory overload. Some children were exposed to strobe reflections in darkness. Others were subjected to layered soundtracks. Lullabies played backward religious chanting slowed to a crawl. When a child responded correctly, that is with silence or apathy, it was called a successful folding. Those children were taken to the garden house for repetition. Those who cried or resisted were recorded as non-pliable. Many of them disappeared from the ledgers within weeks. But perhaps most disturbing were the post-visit reports. These were never filed with local authorities or published in journals. Instead, they were circulated in private academic salons under a code name, the Granhurst Protocols. These protocols were never openly discussed in Parliament or academia, but in 1860 a sealed presentation was delivered to the Royal Institute of Moral Psychology. Its title, On the Suppression of Unwanted Emotional Reflex in Adolescent Subjects. It cited Field Study 3GH North England. That was Granhurst. No one questioned the ethics, because the findings were useful. And still, the visitors kept coming. Some only stayed an hour, others for weeks. One girl listed as H2 was said to have disappeared during a week-long inspection. When Eleanor asked where she'd gone, Sister Nine whispered she was borrowed. That word would haunt her. Borrowed. As if a child were a volume to be read and returned. But no one ever returned. They were never meant to find each other. Granhurst discouraged patterns, discouraged bonds, discouraged sameness. But somehow 4 girls, each in different dorms, different phases, learned to whisper to one another in the gaps between surveillance. Their names as they whispered them were Lena Rose, Margaret Eleanor. Yes, that Eleanor. The one who would someday survive. They had nothing in common at first glance. Different ages, different years of arrival, different origins, one from a workhouse in Leeds, another left at a parish gate in Norwich. But they shared one thing the others had lost. They remembered their names. Not the object names assigned in Phase 4 Bone Thread Ash, but their true names. And more than that, they remembered things. Lena could recall the scent of her father's oil-stained coat. Margaret still knew how to recite a poem in French. Rose remembered the scar on her mother's chin and the song she sang when she brushed her hair. Eleanor, though younger, remembered a voice saying, "You are wanted." They kept these memories like smuggled gold, hiding them from sisters, whispering them at night, refusing to surrender. Their rebellion was quiet. They braided each other's hair and act discouraged as vanity. They hummed the same tune, each pretending not to hear the other. They smiled. Smiling at Granhurst was unmeasured joy, and unmeasured joy was a sign of unprocessed identity. It was dangerous. One night they did something reckless. They carved their names, their real names, beneath the floorboard of Dormitory B. 4 little scratches hidden under a loose slat near the hearth. Not for anyone to find, just for each other. But the next morning Rose was gone. No explanation, no record, just her bed stripped. Her name, her object name, Stone, removed from the log. Margaret cried quietly that night. Eleanor bit her hand until it bled to keep from sobbing. 2 days later, Margaret was summoned to the guidance wing, a place for observation before Garden House. When she returned, she no longer responded to her name. She stared when spoken to. She smiled, but not the same way. And when Lena tried to whisper her favorite poem, Margaret simply blinked and said, "The guide is listening." Lena tried to run. She made it as far as the outer gate, where she was found standing barefoot in the frost facing east. When brought back in, she didn't speak for days. That night, Eleanor watched from her cot as 2 sisters entered and took Lena by the wrists. She whispered, "Don't forget." That was the last time Eleanor heard her voice. Now, alone, Eleanor did something unthinkable. She scratched all 3 names, Lena, Rose, Margaret, into her skin with a broken comb tooth. She thought the pain would help her remember. It did. It also landed her in Ash Room for 6 days. But something had changed. She didn't come out empty. She came out decided that whatever happened, she would remember. And not just for herself. After Lena was taken, Eleanor stopped speaking altogether, but not because they'd broken her. She was listening. At Granhurst, silence was currency. When you spoke, they watched. When you listened, they forgot you were there. And Eleanor, small and quiet, began to vanish into the wallpaper, not in fear, but in strategy. She memorized the sound of footsteps, how Sister Lydia's heels clicked twice before pausing. She counted the number of turns the kitchen key made at lockup, noted which sisters left their ledgers unattended, learned how the infirmary cabinet creaked just once before opening. Eleanor was becoming something rare at Granhurst, a child who learned how the place worked. She began hiding fragments of knowledge in the only place no one could search her mind. Dates, names, phases, object tags. She invented a pattern of association using her own fingers. Thumb dormitory's index. Ash, room, middle garden house. Ring, visitors, pinky, disappearances. When a new child vanished, she'd tap her pinky 3 times. When a visitor came, she tapped the middle. By the end of 1861, her hands had become a map of institutional decay. Then one night, something happened. During evening chores, Eleanor was assigned to polish the chapel floor. While scrubbing beneath the pulpit, her rag caught a loose plank. She pulled it gently and found not dust or rot, but a single sheet of paper folded in 3. It wasn't written in the cold, stiff hand of the sisters. It was slanted, messy human. They made me forget my name, but I scratched it behind the ledge where the light ends. Find it. Remember me. R. Rose. It had to be. Eleanor returned the board. No one saw. She finished polishing, but something inside her clicked. She started searching in hidden corners, behind books, beneath pews, inside discarded aprons in the laundry. What she found wasn't much a pencil stub, a knotted thread, a smear of red wax, but each item became a relic. Proof that someone had tried to resist. She sewed the thread into her sleeve, tucked the pencil stub into the hem of her pillow, traced the wax into a pattern she repeated in her palm when alone. She wasn't just surviving now. She was archiving. She began testing her memory. reciting object names backward, linking staff schedules with bell chimes, whispering the names of the lost into her pillow each night, names like Stonebone, D6R, Lina, Margaret. She became in effect a living ledger no one could burn or edit, but secrets attract suspicion. One day, Sister 9 pulled her aside and asked why she never cried anymore. Eleanor shrugged. "Have I done something wrong?" The sister watched her for a long time, then murmured, "Some girls forget, others pretend. But you, I think you watch." And with that, Eleanor was reassigned from cleaning to observation duty in the infirmary. A promotion, they called it, but really, it meant this. They knew she remembered. And they were about to put her close to the worst of it. The infirmary at Granhurst was kept immaculate. White walls, white beds, white blinds. Cleanliness, they said, was close to God, but underneath that sterile purity was ritual, not of healing, of correction. Eleanor was now its youngest attendant. Her tasks seemed simple: refill the wash basins, fold the linens, light the wall lanterns at dusk. But what she truly did, what no one asked of her, was watch. The infirmary was where children went when they broke down. Some came after sessions in the garden house. Some came after being folded too many times. Some came after simply speaking the wrong name. They entered trembling, fevered, silent. They left one of three ways, numbered blank gone. One girl, known as Thread, arrived with bandages around her temples. No one explained what had happened. When Eleanor gently washed her hands with warm water, the girl flinched, as if it burned. Later that week, Eleanor overheard Sister Lydia speaking to a visitor behind the curtain. The electrical trial produced limited inhibition but full speech fragmentation. She'll enter Phase 5 within the week. Eleanor didn't know the terms then, but she knew Thread never spoke again. There was a room at the back, always locked. The nurses called it the chapel room, but no prayers were said inside. Sometimes the girls brought there came back with fresh markings, a shaved patch of scalp, a square scar behind the left ear, blurred eyes that didn't blink. One ledger Eleanor glimpsed listed these sessions as resonance extractions. No further notes, just timestamps, and initials Dr. A.P. Pendrix. Eleanor kept count. 14 children entered the chapel room over 5 weeks. 9 returned. 3 were reassigned to the garden house. 2 disappeared. She began marking tallies in soap beneath the basin lip, a code only she understood. She also began tracing patient numbers to object names, cross-referencing them with food rations, laundry logs, and bedroll replacements. By now, Eleanor didn't just remember. She was building a map of loss, and in that map she discovered a name missing from every record: Beatrice, the girl who once braided her hair, the first to vanish. No ledger, no number, no ashes recorded, as if she'd been erased so thoroughly even the system forgot her. That terrified Eleanor more than anything, because if Beatrice could be forgotten, so could all of them. But Eleanor had one advantage the others never did. She was still invisible to the system. Just a helper. A child who watched well. And soon she would use that invisibility to step where no child had before, into the chapel room itself. Not as a patient, but as a witness. It was after midnight when Eleanor made her move. She had memorized the nurses' rotations, the creak patterns of the floorboards, and the exact moment the gas lamps were dimmed. The infirmary was asleep, but the door to the chapel room stood cold and locked. She'd seen Sister Lydia retrieve the key from the hem of her robe. Eleanor had spent 3 weeks crafting a wax impression using a lump of candle pressed against a dropped hairpin. Tonight, she used it. The key turned with a whisper. She stepped inside. There was no chapel, no crucifix, no altar, only a single steel chair bolted to the floor, wires coiled around the armrests. A headpiece arched like a broken halo. At its center, a glass plate cloudy with fingerprints stared back like an unblinking eye. To one side, a large wooden cabinet with labeled drawers. Echo maps, fracture cycles, composure charts, phase. Chords inside. Eleanor found stacks of parchment diagrams, illustrations, measurements. But it wasn't medical. It was mechanical memory engineering. One document caught her eye. A flowchart titled Reverse Identity Re-Entry Model Child Class A. Arrows pointed to terms like primary detachment, scripted reformation, ethical delay window. She couldn't understand it all, but the drawings made her stomach twist. A child's silhouette head cut open in sections labeled Faith Fear Family. Another image showed a mirror positioned directly behind the eyes with the note, "Only what is shown in the mirror remains." She realized the machine wasn't meant to remove memory. It was meant to overwrite it, layering false identities onto blank spaces, turning children into believers of manufactured pasts. Suddenly, she heard it. Not footsteps, but something worse. Breathing. Slow. Strained. Not hers. She turned. In the corner stood a figure, slumped, trembling eyes milky and unfocused. It was thread, or what remained of her. A harness held her upright. Her mouth moved, repeating a single phrase. "I am safe. I am found. I am not me." Again and again. She didn't see Eleanor, or maybe she couldn't. Whatever they'd done in this room, it had severed something essential. Eleanor backed away, barely holding her breath. She returned everything as it was, closed the cabinet, relocked the door. But she didn't forget. She couldn't. That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she drew the machine from memory, every bolt, every coil, on scraps of linen beneath her mattress. She listed every phrase she heard, every drawer label, every carved line in the operating chair. It was no longer enough to remember names. Now she would remember how they were lost. The laundress came every Thursday. Her name was Mrs. Hale, a quiet woman from the nearby village of Hunswell. She never spoke to the girls, never looked them in the eye. But she brought clean linens and collected the used ones. And most importantly, she left the gates with parcels. Parcels no one inspected. Eleanor had watched her for months, memorized her routine. She knew the bundle marked Infirmary Secondary. Soiled was never checked. It left sealed. That would be her vessel. She wrote the letter in stolen fragments. Bits of pages torn from the back of scripture books. Ink from crushed berries. A splinter used as a stylus. She wrote with small, tight lines. It read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Eleanor, and I remember. This place is called Granhurst, but it is not a sanctuary. It is a machine that strips memory and replaces it with obedience. They experiment on children. They break us to rebuild us. Some girls have numbers instead of names. Some speak only what they are told. Many vanish. I have seen the chair. I have heard the phrases they repeat. I am writing this because no one else will. If you are reading this, please come. Please look. Please listen. Before we are all gone. E." She folded it 12 times. Wrapped it in linen. Sewed it into the corner of a stained sheet with a single thread just loose enough to be found if searched. Then on Thursday morning she waited. Mrs. Hale arrived precisely at 8:15. The sheets were exchanged in silence. No one spoke, no one suspected. But as the cart wheeled out of the gates, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in months. A pulse of possibility. The next days passed in agonizing stillness. Nothing changed. No visitors, no questions, no guards. Eleanor began to doubt. Had the sheet been washed before anyone found the letter? Had someone read it and thrown it away? Had Mrs. Hale never even looked? But on the 6th day, something strange happened. During morning meal, the sisters called roll not with object names, but with full names. Eleanor's stomach turned when she heard Margaret Ellis. No one responded. Because Margaret had been taken long ago. Because Margaret no longer existed. The sisters exchanged glances. Confused, irritated. Something had been shaken. It meant someone was watching. Not inside, but from beyond. That night, Eleanor returned to the infirmary and opened her hidden ledger, a stitched cloth full of names, dates, and tallies. She wrote a new line at the bottom, message sent, response possible, time uncertain. She did not smile, but she did not cry, and she did not stop. He arrived unannounced, not in a clergy carriage nor with the rustling robes of charity. He wore a gray coat, mud-flecked at the hem, and a black hat pulled low. He did not smile. He carried a folder. And he asked for one thing. The infirmary logs. Complete. from June to present. His name was Mr. Colgrave, and he said he was from the Parish Oversight Committee of Yorkshire. But his accent wasn't local. He had a London sharpness. A man who'd seen too many charitable institutions that turned out to be anything but. Sister Lydia tried to smile to feign warmth. Of course. But you understand. We prefer notice. We run a very delicate operation. I've read the operation, Mr. Colgrave replied, lifting a folded sheet. At the top, the seal of the crown. The sisters fell silent. The next hours were chaos masked in politeness. Ledgers were opened, dormitories inspected. Even the garden house, usually locked, was briefly toured, but not the chapel room. That door remained closed, and when Colgrave asked about it, Sister Nine replied evenly, "That's our Vesper Hall, for prayer and reflection." He nodded, took notes, but didn't ask to see inside. Not yet. Eleanor watched all this from behind the infirmary curtains. She recognized something in Colgrave's posture the way his eyes scanned the same corner she did. He saw patterns. He saw things that didn't add up. She whispered to herself that night he could be the one. But then something happened she did not expect. The next morning, Sister Lydia announced an assembly. She claimed Mr. Colgrave had reviewed their records and found them sufficient. He would leave the next day. No further investigation, no charges, no questions, just gone. Eleanor's throat burned. Had her message failed, had he been paid off threatened, but that evening as she passed the laundry cupboard she noticed something wedged beneath the bottom drawer. A folded paper, no name. She opened it when she was alone. It read, "I see more than I say. Some doors need time, others need proof. If you can get me what's behind the chapel room, leave it in the east well. I'll be watching." See, Eleanor clutched the note until her knuckles turned white. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting. Eleanor waited until the third night after Mr. Colgrave's visit. By then, the sisters had relaxed. Their inspections had returned to routine. Their smiles were genuine again. They believed they were safe. They weren't. At 2:12 a.m., Eleanor entered the infirmary. She had the wax key in one hand, a folded piece of cloth in the other, meant to wrap whatever she might find. She unlocked the chapel room. It smelled of metal, of oil, and salt, and dust. The machine waited still as a predator. The steel chair gleamed under low lantern light. Eleanor approached. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She opened the cabinet drawers with careful hands. Inside, more diagrams. Bone saws, small glass tubes filled with dark sediment, some labeled Phase 5, others memory retained failed. Then she found it. A thick logbook, hardbound, gilt-trimmed. Its spine read Neuropathic Reformation Trials, 1873. She flipped through the pages. Each entry detailed a child's reference name. Procedure date, coil calibration results, notation. Subject. Accepted new parameters or subject, rejected imprint names were redacted, replaced by numbers. Until page 47. They're scribbled in smaller handwriting. Trial 1873-11, B. Beatrice Moore. Vocal resistance high, refused mirror interface treatment halted. Child relocated. Result noncompliant, untraceable. Note no further entry. Beatrice, her real name. Not a fruit, not a phrase, not an object. A person named, documented, and rejected by their own machinery. This was what Colgrave needed. A bridge between the numbered ghosts and real living children. But there was more. On the underside of the steel chair, Eleanor noticed something, a scratch in the metal. She knelt, brushed away the dust. A name, carved crudely with a pin or nails. I remember BM. She froze. Beatrice Moore had left a mark inside the machine that tried to erase her. That was enough. Eleanor wrapped the logbook, tore out page 47, and hid the rest. She'd slid it into the cloth, then into the linen pouch sewn beneath her nightgown. She left the room, locked it again. Before dawn, she crept past the courtyard to the east well. A rotted bucket still hung by a rusted chain. She placed the cloth-wrapped page in a hollow near the base of the stone, then whispered, "Please see it." 3 nights later, she woke to silence, then a knock, soft, deliberate, at the outer gate. She heard Sister Lydia rise. She heard urgent footsteps, voices, paper rustling, a key dropped, and then a sound no child at Granhurst had ever heard, the chapel room door unlocking, from the outside. It didn't happen all at once. No sirens, no soldiers, no fire, just two men in gray coats, and a sealed writ from the Home Office. They entered Granhurst before breakfast, asked no permission, spoke no greetings. They walked directly to the chapel room, unlocked with a master key that made the sisters pale. Inside they found the machine, the ledgers, and Beatrice's name still carved beneath the chair. No words were exchanged, just quiet observation. And when they emerged, Mr. Colgrave simply said, "You'll close within the week. All records to be transferred. All staff suspended. All children relocated." The sisters did not resist, because Granhurst had never prepared for this accountability. The children weren't told much, only that they would be moved, that the board was involved, that the orphanage would no longer house them. Eleanor watched them pack. Some girls cheered, some wept, some stood silent like statues cut from trauma. Eleanor waited. Would someone come for her? On the third day, a woman from York Social Registry arrived with a carriage. She wore no habit, no cross, just plain boots and a wool coat. She called out one name, Eleanor Norwood. No one responded, because Eleanor hadn't heard her name in 5 years. The woman stepped closer, gently touched her shoulder. "It's yours," she said softly. "You can answer to it again." The ride away from Granhurst was quiet. The road dipped into mist, past moors, past ash trees, past everything she thought she would never escape. But she didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, clutching a cloth bundle under her coat, the last piece of Beatrice Moore's logbook. Not because she needed it, but because she owed it to her. They placed Eleanor in a small recovery home in Scarborough, not a real family, but safe. She learned how to speak again, to write in her own words, to dream in her own voice. She never married, never changed her name. But she told the story, to journalists, to doctors, to court officials who filed reports that vanished into locked cabinets. Even when no one wanted to listen, she kept speaking. Years later, someone published a short pamphlet, Testimony of a Forgotten Girl, What Happened at Granhurst. It sold barely 200 copies, but one reached Parliament and another found its way into the archive of a university in London. The machine was never rebuilt. Granhurst became a ruin, swallowed by ivy and silence. But every spring someone placed a single white ribbon on the rusted gate. No name, no note, just a quiet memory of those who forgot themselves, and the one girl who refused.